Silence was the main subject of tranquil Spokane Falls, Washington on August 4, 1889. After a wide variety of fires around the state, a smog had settled over many cities within the state. None of the Spokane Falls citizens expected that their own town could come up in a blaze, but it did. When fire raged among the downtown streets, despite the leadership of the mayor and the fire chief, the fire left its legacy. The effect of such a tragedy was a remembrance of the hard-working and fast-recovering Spokaneans.
Many theories contribute to the lore of how the fire started. Some say the blame falls on a drunk man at a saloon. The story goes that a young woman named Kate was inside the bar area when she caught the eye of a regular drunk at the joint. He tried to flirt with the lady, but she simply went upstairs where the living quarters were for rent. She went to her room to freshen up a little so she may go out, and the drunkard invaded her room trying to get her attention again. As he grew closer, an argument started, and as she broke away from his arms, she knocked over an oil lamp, thereby starting the fire. They both fled the room, desperately praying that no fault would be put to them. While this is the most popular theory, Jack Valentine, an old man from the time of the fire, scoffed at this story in 1964, saying that, in the first place, there wasn't any saloon there. It was a greasy spoon restaurant. There was a rooming house above it, all right. It had a big sign hung over the front that said, Railroaders Home. I remember that. I knew the fellow that owned the place, too. He once told me that the fire started in the kitchen of the restaurant, and I guess he ought to know. This first-hand story goes more in favor of another theory. It says that a man was cooking in a kitchen, and some of the grease from the food caught fire and got the curtains along with it.
Either way, the fire started out rather small, and people knew about it quickly. The original size of the fire was the problem. People saw the smoke from maybe a block away and simply thought of it as a small house fire that wouldn't pose any true threat. According to the Spokane Chronicle, a simple bucket of water could have quenched this mediocre fire, but no water was anywhere to be found. Well then, the fire made its way to the walls of the building and the winds picked up. Before anybody even had time to react, the flames had traveled to another building, and then another, and yet another. This continued until people realized that it was a true hazard to the city and began running into buildings to grab what little belongings they could and to save from the inferno. People scrambled throughout all the town, scrounging up the little bits and pieces from their nearly toasted houses, as others made money hauling citizens' goods in their horse and buggy.
It didn't take long for word to get to the fire department that a large portion of downtown Spokane Falls was up in a blaze, and they rushed to the fire as quickly as they could. The firemen all prepared themselves for a long firefight, but when the hoses were hooked up, there was hardly any pressure. As it turned out, the one who managed the water pressure had taken a day off to work on his boat in Coeur d'Alene and left someone in his place. Though the man left in charge at the Spokane Waterworks was completely certified and supposedly knew what he was doing, nobody could figure out how to make the water pressure any higher. The leadership of the manager could have fixed the situation in its entirety.
As the fire chief and the men working on the water pressure continued their struggle to lead the people away, the mayor became worried. He didn't want this fire to continue any further, causing even more damage. The mayor gave order for detonation of buildings to halt the fire. He knew his authority and leadership as a mayor could save his town. Citizens witnessed the officials hauling in dynamite and began to panic even more than they already had been. The explosion and the collapsed structures hardly slowed the fire as the winds picked up and carried sparks to the next establishments. Not only that, but the wind changed directions just a little bit later, carrying the fire all the way through the city, swallowing up an entire 32 blocks and only stopping when it reached the Spokane River. The leadership of all the men involved was only a waste of time.
Devastation. This is the only word that can be used to describe the hearts of the Spokane Falls citizens after the flames went out. Only one building, the Crescent Store, had survived the blazes. As the piles of ash smoldered, people dragged their few remaining belongings to different areas and made makeshift camps for the night. The city came to be under military rule for a while in fear of possible looting, but according to Perry Klein, there was nothing left to take. Everything was destroyed, and many slept on the bank of the river. New building materials were sent in from all over and had to be guarded. Many families were without food or water due to the 75-plus acres of land toasted. The good taxpayers would be even more devastated to discover that the damages totaled over $6 million. This had been the most expensive fire in Spokane history, and it certainly wasn't the only fire. The Great Fire of 1889 marked the beginning of a series of historic fires within the next several years. A grand total of 18 fires followed, including the ones that burned the Monroe Street Bridge, the Spokane Mill and Flour Company, and the Great Eastern Block.
The total destruction of the fire was recognized not by just the many living within or near the areas affected, but by the entire nation. Of the few things that put Spokane on the map, a fire, of all things, was one of them. Back in the day, Spokane Falls was the largest city in Washington. As news got around that the majority of Washington's most populated city had burned down, it was big news. Men all over the country were astonished at the sudden annihilation of such a town. Spokane's suffering was even acknowledged by the president at the time, Benjamin Harrison. All of the support and encouragement from their fellow Americans really got the Spokane people bustling.
Though the damages were great, there was some relief from their enormous bill. Cities from all over the Pacific Northwest sent in money, materials, and food for those in need. Even Seattle, which had a large fire of its own, sent in a hefty supply of money. With the new materials and money at their disposal, the Spokaneites got to work by rebuilding their city the very next day. Tents were pitched for businesses to resume as usual, and the largest one was the casino, which was held in a giant circus tent. Though many couldn't even set up a tent to revive their businesses, they could work and still support themselves by building houses and other structures in the rebuilding of the town. In fact, nearly everyone in Spokane, except for mothers and young children, labored in these times.
As a result of the fear of another fire sometime into the future, the civilians of Spokane Falls constructed all their new buildings out of non-flammable materials. All sorts of mortar, brick, and granite were sent and shipped in from all over not only the state, but the entirety of the Northwest. As the men worked, they could be confident that their hard laboring would mean that there wouldn't be any further fires as devastating as the one they had endured. They built these buildings to last, and they most certainly did. Much of the brickwork and fireproofing on downtown can still be seen today on many of the structures. These stores, houses, apartments, and businesses all leave their own mark on Spokane, whether they like it or not. The tragedy and hardships of ancestors of modern-day Spokaneites led to not only the legacy of the physical look of the city, but the reputation of the people that live amongst it.
Nowadays, people walk up and down the streets of downtown Spokane, Washington. Many are unaware of the stories behind the walls and structures around them. They may be only looking to get into the mall, unaware that entirely different buildings used to reside there. Kids frolic and play in the riverfront park, oblivious to the fact that multiple families slept in makeshift campsites in the same place that they run through. Everyday average citizens stroll in all the places and streets of Spokane, a place that could have smoldered alongside the fire, not knowing that the only reason their house near Midway Elementary, or on the South Hill, or in Meade only exists because the predecessing civilians of Spokane had the strength to carry on and expand their homeland.